So good to have you join us today. Hello and welcome to Business Daily. I'm Lee Ji-yoon in Seoul. Before we get started, let's first take a quick look at today's highlights. There are growing expectations that China's yuan will further depreciate, and this is sparking concerns of a renewed currency war with its Asian neighbors. Finally, ready for liftoff, the U.S. Federal Reserve is poised to raise interest rates this week after having kept rates near zero since December 2008. We talk with an expert about how this will affect Korea and the global economy. But first, we have a fresh economic projection for Korea's small and medium-sized businesses next year, and it's not rosy. IBK Economic Research Institute released a report on Tuesday in which it forecast continuing production stagnation and sluggish investment for SMEs in 2016. It noted the first 9 months of this year saw the divide between the production and inventory indices widen by the deepest margin seen since the 1998 Asian financial crisis at 15.1 points, a trend likely to continue into the new year. And as interest rates are set to begin their rise, cash supply is also expected to be harder to come by. China's currency, the yuan, traded at a 4.5-year low against the U.S. dollar last week. Now, concerns are the currency will slide even farther, which is bad news for Korea's struggling exporters. Our Kim Min-ji tells us why.
Will the Chinese yuan depreciate even further? According to a Bloomberg survey of 64 foreign investment banks, the yuan is expected to trade at an average of 6.61 against the US dollar at the end of next year, which means on year the Chinese currency is forecast to lose 2.3% of its value. Already last week, the yuan hit its lowest level against the dollar in more than 4 years. This after China announced that it intends to depeg the yuan from the dollar and instead manage the yuan to track a basket of 13 currencies, including the dollar, euro, and yen, which would give the yuan room to fall further against the dollar. Analysts see the move as an attempt to manage the yuan's weakness against the greenback ahead of a widely expected U.S. rate hike this week, as a strengthening dollar in turn would raise the value of the yuan. China has been cutting interest rates to loosen monetary policy and boost its slowing growth. Some analysts warn, however, that the decline in the value of the yuan could trigger competitive devaluations, as other nations could weaken their respective currencies to maintain trade competitiveness. Analysts say Korea, considered one of the most vulnerable to a weak yuan, will likely see slower exports due to weak price competitiveness in areas it competes with China. Kim Min-ji, Business Daily.
All eyes are on the U.S. Federal Reserve this week, as it is largely expected to raise its interest rates for the first time in nearly a decade. Is the U.S. economy finally ready for a liftoff? Let's find out.
The Federal Reserve will employ all available tools to promote the resumption of sustainable economic growth and to preserve price stability. On December 16, 2008, the U.S. Federal Reserve announced after its FOMC meeting that it would cut its benchmark interest rate to a record low range between 0 and 0.25% to try to stimulate the U.S. economy. So by lowering rates and pumping out vast amounts of money for businesses and consumers, the Fed was trying to fight the recession by reviving the frozen credit market and encouraging spending. And thanks to its unprecedented moves, the U.S. economy was able to get back on track. Although the U.S. hasn't hit its inflation target of 2% for more than 3 years, the labor market has been steadily improving, and a series of strong jobs reports have given confidence to Fed officials that prices can pick up. But amid lingering uncertainties in the global economy, led by slowing growth in China, how will the Fed's rate hike affect other major economies around the world, including Korea?
And to tell us more about this, Professor Yang Jun-seok from the Catholic University of Korea joins us in the studio today. So good to see you, Professor.
Happy to be here.
So the U.S. Fed Reserve is expected to raise its interest rates for the first time in nearly a decade. Why did it take us so long for it to finally raise its rates?
Well, because the global financial crisis was so bad. We had the shock caused by the global financial crisis was so bad that they had to keep on continuing to lower the rates. And in fact, according to some analysts, U.S. had to go into negative interest rates, which is obviously impossible. So they tried things like quantitative easing and Operation Twist, which tried to mimic having a negative short-term interest rates. But now things have been improving just a little by little since the last 2 or 3 years. And now I think the Fed seems to be saying that, well, having an interest rate at zero actually is very abnormal. So let's try to at least go back to the normal to see what it's like. So I think that they're trying an experiment here, and they think the economy is strong enough to take it this time.
Well, so all eyes are on this FOMC meeting scheduled for Tuesday and Wednesday local time. How much of an impact could this hike in interest rates have on the global economy then?
Okay, well, because the United States and most of the other advanced economies have effectively zero interest rate, you have a lot of money flowing out into the emerging market. Now, the big fear here is that even with a very slight increase in interest rates, you'll see that money pulling back. Now, in some cases like Venezuela or Indonesia or India, they've used that money up already, like Korea did in the 97 and 98 financial crisis. So they're afraid that if too much money is pulled out of the market too quickly, we might have some foreign exchange rate crisis in some of these emerging economies. Now, obviously, the emerging economies know this, and they've been preparing for it for the last 2 or 3 years,
right.
But no one's quite sure if that preparation is going to be enough. Another big mystery is that, well, we never had 0% interest rate for this long. And all the dealers who work in the financial market, they're usually in their late 20s. The oldest of them are in early 30s. So they may not remember the period where we had non-zero interest rates. So that's a big fear right there. Theoretically, another fear is that, well, with 0% interest rate, the government bonds and cash were effectively the same. So we had a very unusual circumstances for a long time. But with a positive interest rate, now money and government bonds will be different because bonds will actually be paying interest. And some people are afraid what's going to happen when people start to distinguish between having money and having government bonds, whether they'll cause a lot of inflation or whether it will cause some really big shocks in the bond market.
Right, but then the Fed did try to raise interest rates several times this year, but fell short of doing so because of some external and obviously internal uncertainties in the global economy as well as the U.S. economy. But now the Fed Chair Janet Yellen is determined to raise the rates, saying that there's no reason to delay this. How much of an increase are we expecting here?
Okay. For the December meeting, it's going to be no more than 0.25%.
0.25.
They're going to be very conservative here because we're in a very unusual circumstances. What's going to be more of a mystery will be how much will they raise it overall next year. If you look at some of the surveys of the Fed governors, the people who will be voting in this FOMC over the next year, some have gone as high as 1.5%.
Wow.
And then I think most analysts are saying maybe around 1%, so they'll raise it by 0.25% 4 times over the year. But then if you look at the 30-year Treasury bond rate right now, it's only 2.9%. So that means that they'll raise it a lot slower. I think they're going to be very careful about raising the rates, especially during the first half of the year. They're going to see what this particular increase is going to do. So my personal guess would be less than 1%, perhaps 0.5. But this is a great experiment.
Right.
So at least in terms of theory, it's going to be interesting how the market reacts.
All right, so obviously the U.S. economy is believed to be on a recovery track, but this is not really the story for other countries around the world. So how much of an impact will this have on struggling major economies right now?
Okay, well, this 0% interest rate has been effectively acting as an expansionary monetary policy for the entire world. And this signals that the U.S. is going to step back from that. And as I mentioned before, there's a good chance that the money will flow out of the emerging markets, which will make the situation in the emerging markets a bit tougher. But on the other hand, if this really does signal a recovery in the US, hopefully that can also act as an engine of growth and a signal that the global economy is returning to normal. If we can actually signal that it is returning to normal, perhaps it'll be a good thing for the global economy.
Okay, then what about Korea? I mean, Korea's household debt is hitting record high levels, but at this point, where all eyes are on the U.S. Fed rate hike, so what kind of impact will this have on the Korean economy?
Okay, well, every time that there's been a rumor that the United States would raise the interest rate, there has been a lot of fluctuations in the Korean exchange rates and the Korean stock market, and we're seeing that again right now. Hopefully, once the U.S. raises the interest rate and there's no real big shocks or real big fluctuations, then hopefully next time the Fed raises the rates, things will be more stable. At least that's what I'm hoping anyway. 2.25% really shouldn't have that much problem for the emerging markets. It's not that big a difference of a rate.
Okay.
But because we haven't had a positive rate for such a long time, there's probably going to be a lot of fluctuations, a lot of shock effects, at least for about a week. And then we'll see whether that develops into foreign exchange rate crisis for other economies or not. Korea, I think, has a very low chance of going into foreign exchange rate crisis because we have so much foreign reserves built up. But some other countries go into foreign exchange rate crisis, that obviously will mean problems for Korea as well. Over the longer term, Korea has a lot of household debt, a lot of government debt, and increase in the U.S. interest rates will probably mean that Korean rates, at least for the private market, will go up as well. And that means more interest rate debt burden for the household debt. And possibly, if the global rates continue to go up and Bank of Korea is forced to match those rates, then the interest rate for government will go up as well. So that'll mean more interest rate burden on the existing government debt.
All right, thank you so much for coming in today, Professor.
Thank you.
On top of mobile payment services like Samsung Pay, Apple Pay, and Kakao Pay competing to grab a larger piece of the pie in the Korean market, Chinese fintech firms are also seeking to expand their presence as well. Our Lee Joo-young tells us more.
1 second is all it takes. This man is using a service from China's biggest credit card company, UnionPay, that offers a contactless payment platform called QuickPass, catering to 80% of the Chinese population that owns a smartphone.
I can use this service at many places and don't need my card or my wallet, so I use it a lot.
According to Korea Trade Investment Promotion Agency, Chinese consumers spent roughly $1.2 trillion in mobile payment services last year, up about 50% from the year before. And thanks to the enormous purchasing power of Chinese tourists in Korea, who spent over $11 billion, Chinese fintech companies, including Alibaba, Tencent, and UnionPay, are trying to increase their presence in Korea, competing with local rivals like Kakao, Naver, and Samsung. Alibaba's Alipay has already been installed in over 20,000 stores in Korea. UnionPay says it's affiliated with over 8,600 shopping malls and convenience stores near the Dongdaemun area and plans to further develop its partnership with BC Card in Korea.
We intend to provide new and convenient payment technology for our Korean customers with our communications and IT affiliates.
Experts say despite Korea's relatively small market size, the country is becoming an increasingly attractive destination for global ICT firms, being one of the most wired nations in the world. Lee Joo-young, Business Daily.
Digital certificates are used here in Korea to verify one's identity when making electronic transactions. But starting next year, users will be able to use their fingerprints to greenlight a purchase or transfer. Our Eunice Kim has more.
For better or for worse, digital certificates enter the lives of Koreans everywhere, along with a cybersecurity law passed in 1999. It required Koreans to adopt the authentication ticket to make any online transaction over 300,000 won. That's about $250. In doing so, users were predominantly required to use Microsoft's ActiveX plugin, accessible only on the Internet Explorer browser, a process long criticized as cumbersome and susceptible to crashes. Nonetheless, as of July, 65% of Koreans, that's 33 million people, were still using the verification method. And now, urged by the president herself, the ICT Ministry-affiliated Korea Internet and Security Agency has announced it is ready to test run a new technology that would replace a lengthy alphanumeric password with fingerprints.
The fingerprint revision through smartphones will make the verification process easier, as it will no longer require the use of extra plugins like ActiveX.
The idea is this. Users save their fingerprint identity using the fingerprint sensor on their smartphones and use the same sensor to sign off on online purchases or cash transfers, even those on their desktops. KISA plans to begin testing next month in partnership with major online shopping malls as it transmits relevant technologies to companies related to payment, distribution, and finance. Eunice Kim, Business Daily.
And that wraps it up for today. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll be back tomorrow at the same time, same place for your Business Daily. Until then, goodbye.